They say the smallest acts echo loudest in empty pockets. I learned that truth inside a Chicago diner where a waitress with $3 in her apron paid for a stranger's meal and changed both their lives forever. The rain hammered against the windows of Rosie's diner that November night, turning the neon sign outside into a blurred halo of pink and blue. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and fresh apple pie mixed with the sound of forks scraping plates and the low hum of tired conversations. It was 10:30 on a Tuesday, and the place was almost empty. Just a couple of truck drivers nursing their third cups of coffee, a teenage girl studying calculus at the corner booth, and Sofia Martinez wiping down table 7 for the 4th time that hour. Sofia was 22 years old, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide anymore. Her black work shoes had a hole in the left sole that let in rainwater every time she stepped outside. Her uniform was clean but faded, the name tag slightly crooked because the pin had broken months ago, and she'd been using a safety pin ever since. She moved through the diner with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for 3 years. But tonight, her movements were slower, heavier, because in her apron pocket, folded into a tight square, was her last $20 bill, and tomorrow, rent was due. The bell above the door chimed, and a gust of cold wind carried in a man who looked like he'd been sleeping under bridges. His coat was torn at the shoulder, his jeans were stained with mud, and his gray beard was matted and wet. He stood in the doorway for a moment, water dripping from his clothes onto the checkered floor, his eyes scanning the room like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be there. Sofia looked up from the table she was wiping and felt her heart squeeze. She'd seen that look before, the look of someone who hadn't eaten in days. But before we go any further, let me ask you something. If you believe in second chances, if you believe that one small choice can change everything, comment the country you're watching from right now. Let's see how far this story travels tonight. And if this opening already hit you somewhere deep, smash that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this. Because what happens next will make you believe in humanity again. Sofia had come to Chicago 4 years ago with a scholarship to study nursing at community college and dreams bigger than the Rust Belt town she'd left behind. Her mother had died when she was 16, leaving her and her younger brother Miguel in the care of an aunt who did her best, but couldn't afford to send them both to school. So Sofia had worked. She'd worked at gas stations and grocery stores and finally landed at Rosie's diner, where the owner, a woman named Ruth, had kind eyes and didn't ask too many questions when Sofia showed up for her shift with textbooks under her arm. For 3 years, Sofia had managed. She juggled full-time classes with night shifts, survived on ramen noodles, and the occasional free meal from Ruth when the kitchen made too much food. She'd sent money home to Miguel every month so he could finish high school. She'd studied in the diner's back booth during slow hours, her medical textbooks spread across the table next to ketchup bottles and sugar packets. She'd been so close to finishing her degree, just one more semester. But then the tuition had gone up. Financial aid had been cut. Her student loans were maxed out, and the payment plan she'd arranged had fallen through when her hours at the diner got reduced during the summer slump. 3 weeks ago, she'd gotten the letter from the registrar's office. Without full payment by December 1st, she'd be withdrawn from her classes. 4 years of work, gone. 4 years of sacrificing sleep and meals and any semblance of a social life, all about to disappear because she was $800 short. Tonight, Sofia had exactly $23 to her name, $20 in her apron pocket, $3 in change in her car's cup holder. Her rent was $450, due tomorrow morning, and her landlord had already told her this was the last time he'd accept it late. She'd been awake since 4 in the morning, had worked a double shift, and her feet felt like they were on fire. Every muscle in her body ached, but she smiled at the man in the doorway anyway, because that's what you did. That's what her mother had taught her. You smiled at people who had it worse than you, because sometimes a smile was all you had to give. The man shuffled toward the counter, leaving wet footprints behind him, and Sofia met him there with a menu. He didn't take it. He just looked at her with watery blue eyes and asked if she had any food that was about to be thrown out. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. Sofia felt something crack open in her chest. She glanced back toward the kitchen where Ruth had left for the night, leaving Sofia to close up alone. The cook, a man named Jimmy who'd been working at Rosie's for 15 years, was smoking a cigarette out back. Sofia set the menu down and told the man to sit anywhere he liked. He chose the booth by the window, the one that looked out onto the rain-soaked street, and he sat down slowly, like his bones hurt. Sofia poured him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one, added 2 creams and 3 sugars the way people did when they needed the calories more than the taste, and set it in front of him. He wrapped his hands around the mug and closed his eyes, breathing in the steam. She asked him what he'd like to eat, and he said he didn't have any money. He said it plainly, without shame, the way you state a fact like, the sky is blue or the rain is cold. Sofia nodded and told him not to worry about it. She said the kitchen had made too much meatloaf tonight, and it would just go to waste anyway, which was a lie. The kitchen hadn't made too much of anything, but she said it with such confidence that the man almost believed her. She walked back to the kitchen and told Jimmy to make a full plate. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a slice of apple pie. Jimmy raised an eyebrow and asked who was paying for it, and Sofia said she was. She pulled the $20 bill from her apron pocket, the one that was supposed to go toward rent, and handed it to Jimmy. He looked at her for a long moment, his cigarette dangling from his lips, and then he shook his head and got to work. He didn't say anything, but she could see him judging the weight of what she'd just done. 10 minutes later, Sofia set the plate in front of the man. He stared at it like it was a mirage, like if he blinked it might disappear. He looked up at her with tears in his eyes and asked her, why? Why would she do this for a stranger? And Sofia, who was so tired she could barely stand, who had $3 left in the world and no idea how she was going to pay rent tomorrow, just smiled and told him that everyone deserves a warm meal on a cold night. The man ate slowly, savoring every bite like it was the first meal he'd had in weeks. Maybe it was. Sofia went back to wiping down tables, but she kept glancing over at him, watching the way his shoulders relaxed with each forkful, the way color came back to his face. When he finished, he folded his napkin carefully and left it on the plate, then stood up and walked to the counter where Sofia was counting the till. He thanked her, his voice thick with emotion, and told her that kindness like hers was rarer than she knew. He said he'd remember this night for the rest of his life. Sofia told him it was nothing, just a meal, but the man shook his head. He said it was everything. Then he walked out into the rain, pulling his torn coat tight around his shoulders, and disappeared into the Chicago night. Sofia locked the door behind him and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. Her apron pocket was empty now except for the receipt Jimmy had given her. $23 had become $3. She had no idea how she was going to pay rent tomorrow, no idea how she was going to eat this week. But as she turned off the diner lights and stepped out into the rain, she felt something unexpected. Not regret, not fear, just a quiet sense of rightness, like maybe her mother was watching somewhere and smiling. What Sofia didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she walked 6 blocks to her apartment in shoes that let in the rain, was that the man in the torn coat had been watching her for weeks. What she didn't know was that the security camera above the diner's entrance had recorded everything. What she didn't know was that her life had just changed forever. And it would take 6 more months of struggle, 6 more months of sacrifice, before she'd understand that the smallest acts really do echo the loudest. The next morning, Sofia woke up to 17 missed calls from her landlord and a knot in her stomach that felt like concrete. She sat on the edge of her mattress, which was just a twin-size futon on the floor of a studio apartment, so small you could touch both walls if you spread your arms wide, and stared at the 3 crumpled dollar bills on her nightstand. The math was simple and brutal. $450 due, $3 in hand. $447 short. She called her landlord back and did something she'd never done before. She begged. She explained about the tuition increase, about the reduced hours at the diner, about sending money home to Miguel. She promised she'd have the rent by Friday if he could just give her 4 more days. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that feels like a door closing, and then he sighed. He told her Friday, or she was out. No exceptions this time. Sofia thanked him, her voice shaking, and hung up before he could hear her cry. She worked every shift Ruth would give her that week. She picked up hours from other waitresses who called in sick. She stayed late to deep clean the kitchen for an extra $20. She survived on coffee and the dinner rolls Jimmy would sneak her when Ruth wasn't looking, telling herself that crackers counted as breakfast and sleep was overrated anyway. On Wednesday night, she tutored 3 kids from the neighborhood in math and biology, charging $15 an hour because she couldn't bring herself to charge more, even though she needed it desperately. One of the kids, a boy named Marcus, whose single mother worked 2 jobs, had shown up without his textbook again. Sofia had lent him hers, even though she needed it for her own studying. By Thursday, she had $280. She was still $170 short. She sat in her car in the diner parking lot after her shift, her head against the steering wheel, and considered calling Miguel. But she knew her brother was barely making it himself, working at a warehouse while taking night classes, and the thought of asking him for money when she'd been the one sending money home for years made her feel like she'd failed at the one thing she'd promised her mother she'd do. "Take care of your brother," her mother had whispered in the hospital, her hand cold in Sofia's. "No matter what." On Friday morning, Sofia walked into Ruth's office and asked for an advance on her next paycheck. Ruth, who was 63 with silver hair and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck, looked up from her ledger and studied Sofia's face. She saw the dark circles, the way Sofia's uniform hung a little looser than it had a month ago, the tremor in her hands that came from too much caffeine and not enough food. Ruth asked her how much she needed, and when Sofia said $170, Ruth opened her desk drawer and counted out $200 in cash. She told Sofia to consider it a bonus for all the extra shifts she'd been pulling. Sofia tried to protest, tried to insist it was a loan she'd pay back, but Ruth waved her off and told her to get back to work before the breakfast rush. Sofia paid her rent that afternoon with $11 to spare. She bought a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter with 8 of those dollars, kept 3 in her pocket, and told herself she'd done it. She'd survived another month. But that night, lying on her futon and listening to the radiator clank and hiss, she wondered how much longer she could keep this up. How many more months of this before something gave? Before she gave? What Sofia didn't know was that the man in the torn coat hadn't forgotten about her. What she didn't know was that he'd come back to the diner 3 times in the past 2 weeks, always during her shifts, always sitting in the corner booth where he could watch her work. He never ordered anything, just sat there with a cup of coffee he'd paid for this time, watching the way she smiled at customers, even when they were rude, watching the way she slipped extra fries onto kids' plates, watching the way she stayed an hour after closing to help Jimmy mop the floors because he'd mentioned his back was hurting. December came with snow and bitter wind that cut through Sofia's thin coat like glass. The coat was 5 years old, bought at a thrift store during her first winter in Chicago, and the zipper had broken 2 years ago, so she held it closed with her hands when she walked. She'd been meaning to replace it, but coats cost money, and there was always something more urgent. Rent, textbooks, the $100 she sent to Miguel every month, the $30 she gave to the church food pantry she used to visit when things got really bad, back before she decided she couldn't take food from families who needed it more than she did. On the first Wednesday of December, an elderly woman came into the diner during the dinner rush. She was small and frail, with hands that shook when she tried to count out change from her purse to pay for a cup of soup. Sofia watched her struggle and felt that familiar squeeze in her chest. She walked over and told the woman the soup was part of a senior discount special tonight, half price. The woman's face lit up with relief and gratitude. There was no senior discount special. Sofia paid the difference out of her tips. She did things like that all the time now, small things that added up. When a young mother came in with 2 hungry children and a wallet that was clearly empty, Sofia told her the kids' meals were on special. Buy one, get one free. When a college student counted out pennies for a coffee, Sofia charged him for a small and gave him a large. When a man came in on Christmas Eve, alone and sad-eyed, and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, Sofia brought him the full holiday dinner and told him the cook had made too much. Ruth noticed. Of course Ruth noticed. She ran a tight ship and knew her numbers, and she could see that Sofia's cash drawer came up short nearly every shift. $20 here, $15 there. Never enough to be theft, always just enough to be suspicious. So one night in January, after the dinner rush died down, Ruth pulled Sofia into her office and asked her point blank if she was stealing. Sofia's face went white. She shook her head so hard her ponytail whipped back and forth, and she started explaining in a rush about the elderly woman and the young mother and the lonely man on Christmas Eve. She said she'd been covering the difference from her tips, that she'd never taken money from the register, that she could show Ruth her tip jar and prove it. Ruth held up a hand to stop her, and for a terrifying moment Sofia thought she was about to be fired. But then Ruth did something unexpected. She asked Sofia why. Why would she give away her own money when she was barely surviving herself? Sofia opened her mouth to answer, but found she didn't have words. How do you explain that you can't watch people go hungry when you know what hunger feels like? How do you explain that your mother raised you to believe that you share what you have, even when you don't have much? How do you explain that some nights, the only thing that helps you sleep is knowing you made someone else's day a little less hard? Ruth looked at her for a long time, her expression unreadable, and then she said something Sofia would never forget. She said that Sofia reminded her of her daughter, who'd been a nurse and died in a car accident 10 years ago. She said her daughter had the same ridiculous habit of giving away everything she had, the same inability to look away from suffering. Then Ruth told Sofia that from now on, if someone came in who couldn't pay, Sofia should give them the meal and write it off as a comp. No more paying from her own pocket. The diner could afford it. Ruth had been in business for 30 years, and she'd be damned if she let one of her best waitresses go broke from being too kind. Sofia cried right there in Ruth's office, the kind of crying that's been building for months and finally breaks through. Ruth handed her tissues and told her to pull herself together before she scared the customers. But there was a softness in her voice, a knowing, and when Sofia left the office, her shoulders felt a little lighter. What neither of them knew was that the man in the torn coat had been there that night too, not in the diner, but across the street, standing under the awning of a closed bookstore, watching through the window. He'd been coming back every few weeks now, always in different clothes, sometimes clean-shaven, sometimes not, sometimes in a coat that wasn't torn, sometimes in the same ratty one, testing something, observing, taking notes in a small leather journal he kept in his pocket. The CCTV cameras captured everything, every meal Sofia paid for with her tips, every extra portion she snuck onto a plate, every time she stayed late to cover someone else's shift. Every time she smiled at a rude customer and said it was no problem really, even though her feet were bleeding inside her broken shoes. The cameras saw everything, and so did he. By March, Sofia was barely holding on. She'd managed to scrape together enough to keep paying rent, but her tuition debt had gone to collections, and her registration for the spring semester had been canceled. 4 years of work, gone. She'd stopped talking about nursing school, stopped carrying her textbooks to work, stopped pretending she was going to finish. The dream had slipped through her fingers like water, and all she could do was watch it disappear. She threw herself into work instead. If she couldn't be a nurse, she could at least be the best damn waitress Rosie's diner had ever seen. She memorized regulars' orders, learned their names and their kids' names, and their favorite jokes. She decorated the diner for St. Patrick's Day with paper shamrocks she'd cut out by hand, because Ruth said they couldn't afford decorations this year. She organized a coat drive for the homeless shelter, hanging a sign in the window and collecting donations from customers. She brought in 17 coats, including her own broken one, because someone needed it more. Ruth gave her a raise in April. Not much, just 50 cents more an hour, but it was something. Ruth told her she was the best employee she'd ever had, that customers came back specifically to sit in Sofia's section, that the diner's Yelp reviews had gone from 3 stars to 4.5 in 6 months, and most of them mentioned Sofia by name. Ruth said if she ever decided to open another restaurant, she'd want Sofia to run it. Sofia smiled and thanked her, and went home that night and cried, because running a diner hadn't been the dream. Saving lives had been the dream. On a Tuesday night in May, almost exactly 6 months after she'd paid for the stranger's meal, Sofia was closing the diner alone again. Jimmy had gone home early with a migraine. Ruth was visiting her sister in Indiana, and it was just Sofia and the hum of the refrigerators and the buzz of the neon sign outside. She was wiping down the last table when she heard a knock at the door. The sign said closed, but she looked up anyway, and her breath caught in her throat. It was the man from that rainy November night, but he didn't look homeless anymore. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Sofia's rent, shoes so polished they reflected the diner lights, and his beard was neatly trimmed. His gray hair was combed back, and he stood with the posture of someone who commanded rooms. For a moment, Sofia didn't recognize him, and then she saw his eyes, those same watery blue eyes, and something clicked. She walked to the door, her heart pounding, and unlocked it. The man smiled at her, that same grateful smile from 6 months ago, and asked if he could come in. Sofia nodded, too stunned to speak, and stepped aside. He walked in slowly, looking around the diner like he was seeing it for the first time, even though she'd later learn he'd been here dozens of times since that night. He ran his hand along the counter, examined the menu board, studied the pictures of regular customers that Ruth had pinned to a corkboard by the register. Then he turned to Sofia and introduced himself. His name was Thomas Whitmore, and he owned this diner. He owned this building. He owned 7 other restaurants in Chicago and had been in the hospitality business for 35 years. And 6 months ago, he'd been about to sell everything and retire because he'd lost faith in people. He'd lost faith that kindness still existed in a world that seemed to only reward selfishness. Sofia felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. She stammered something about not understanding, about him being homeless, about the torn coat and the mud-stained jeans. Thomas smiled sadly and explained that he'd been testing something. 6 months ago, his wife of 40 years had passed away from cancer. The grief had broken him, made him bitter and cynical. He'd started believing that the world was full of people who only cared about themselves, that generosity was dead, that the restaurant business he'd built his life around had become just another way for people to take advantage of each other. So he'd decided to sell everything. But first, he'd wanted to do an experiment. He'd disguised himself as a homeless man and visited his own restaurants, wanting to see how his employees would treat someone they thought had nothing to offer them. He'd visited 6 of his 7 locations over the course of 2 weeks, and at every single one, he'd been ignored, or kicked out, or treated with barely concealed disgust. Rosie's diner had been his last stop. He'd been ready to confirm his worst beliefs about humanity, sell his business, and spend the rest of his life alone in his grief. And then Sofia had bought him dinner with her last $20. She'd given him kindness when she had every reason not to, and he'd been coming back ever since, watching her, documenting everything she did. Thomas pulled out a tablet from his briefcase and told Sofia he wanted to show her something that would explain everything. Sofia's hands were shaking as she wiped them on her apron, and she felt tears building behind her eyes, even though she didn't understand why yet. Thomas turned the tablet toward her and pressed play. And what Sofia saw on that screen would change everything she thought she knew about the last 6 months of her life. But before Thomas pressed play, before the CCTV footage started rolling and the truth came flooding out, let me ask you something. If you were Thomas, would you have checked the cameras first? Would you have watched someone for 6 months before revealing yourself? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And if you're halfway through this story and your heart is already breaking, hit that subscribe button. We drop stories like this every single week, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Because what Sofia is about to see will make you believe in the power of unseen kindness. The tablet screen glowed in the dim light of the empty diner, and Sofia could see her own reflection in it before the video started playing. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who'd been running on empty for so long she'd forgotten what full felt like. Thomas held the tablet steady and told her that what she was about to see was 6 months of security footage compiled into a single video. He said he'd had his IT team pull every moment the cameras had captured of her, every interaction, every gesture, every act she thought no one was watching. Sofia's stomach twisted. She thought about all the time she'd been short with difficult customers when she was too tired to be patient. All the time she'd leaned against the counter, hiding the fact that she was fighting back tears. All the time she'd made mistakes, dropped plates, forgotten orders because her mind was somewhere else, worrying about rent or tuition or Miguel. She thought about the time she'd eaten leftover fries straight from customer plates in the kitchen because she was too hungry to care about dignity. All of it had been recorded. She started to tell Thomas that she wasn't perfect, that he'd see her at her worst on those cameras, that she'd made plenty of mistakes. But Thomas shook his head and told her to just watch. He said what he was about to show her wasn't about perfection. It was about character. It was about who someone is when they think no one is keeping score. And then he pressed play. The first clip was from that November night 6 months ago. The timestamp read 10:34 p.m., and Sofia watched herself on the screen, looking even more tired than she remembered feeling. She watched the stranger in the torn coat walk in, watched herself pour him coffee, watched the conversation at the counter. But the camera angle showed something she hadn't been able to see that night. It showed Jimmy in the kitchen doorway, watching her hand over her last $20. It showed him shaking his head, not in judgment like she'd thought, but in disbelief. It showed him making the plate with extra portions, adding a second slice of pie. It showed him watching through the service window as the stranger ate, and then turning away to wipe his eyes. The video jumped to the next morning, November 13th, 8:47 a.m. Sofia was there in her same clothes from the night before, not because she was working a double, but because she'd come in early to ask Ruth for the advance. The camera showed her sitting in the parking lot for 20 minutes first, her head on the steering wheel, clearly gathering courage. When she finally walked in, her shoulders were squared, her chin up, even though anyone could see she was terrified. The clips came faster now, jumping through weeks and months. December 4th, 6:23 p.m. The elderly woman with shaking hands counting pennies for soup. Sofia's face on the camera was so gentle, so patient, as she bent down to the woman's eye level and explained the fake senior discount. The camera caught the moment after the woman left, when Sofia opened her tip jar and moved money into the register to cover the difference. $15 she'd earned that shift, gone in an instant. December 8th, 2:15 p.m. The young mother with 2 hungry children. The camera showed the kids' eyes light up when Sofia brought them each a full kids' meal with chocolate milk and apple slices. It showed the mother's shoulders shake with silent crying as Sofia walked away. It showed Sofia looking back from the kitchen doorway, watching the family eat, and smiling even though tears were running down her own face. December 24th, 9:47 p.m., Christmas Eve. The lonely man in the corner booth. The camera showed Sofia bringing him the full turkey dinner with all the trimmings, a meal that cost $28 that he hadn't ordered. It showed her sitting with him for 5 minutes during her break, just talking, keeping him company. The audio on this clip had been enhanced, and Thomas turned up the volume. Sofia heard her own voice asking the man about his family, learning that his daughter didn't speak to him anymore, that he'd been sober for 6 months and was trying to rebuild his life. She heard herself telling him that 6 months was an achievement, that he should be proud, that tomorrow was a new chance to keep going. Sofia's hand went to her mouth. She didn't remember that conversation. She'd had so many conversations like that over the months, with so many lonely people, that they'd all blurred together. But this man had remembered. The camera showed him leaving a $5 tip on a meal he thought was cheap, not knowing it had come from Sofia's pocket. It showed him walking out into the snow with his shoulders a little straighter. January 9th, 11:34 a.m. A college student, maybe 19, counting out pennies and nickels for a small coffee. The camera showed Sofia's fingers on the register, ringing up a small but pouring a large. It showed the student's grateful smile, and then showed him sitting in a booth for 4 hours, studying for an exam, while Sofia kept refilling his coffee for free. At the end of his study session, the camera caught him leaving a $1 tip, probably all he had. Sofia had picked it up and immediately put it in the jar on the counter marked Local Food Bank Donations. January 17th, 3:22 p.m. A man in a business suit being aggressively rude to Sofia because his burger was cooked medium instead of medium rare. The camera showed Sofia apologizing profusely, taking the plate back, asking Jimmy to remake it. It showed the man berating her, using words that made Thomas wince as he watched. It showed Sofia's face staying calm and kind, even as her hands trembled. When she brought the new burger, the man didn't say thank you, just grunted and turned away. The camera showed Sofia walking into the supply closet afterward and finally letting herself cry for 90 seconds before washing her face and going back to work. February 3rd, 7:45 p.m. A family came in, clearly struggling. The father's work boots were caked with mud and concrete dust. The mother's coat was held together with duct tape. They had 3 children under 10, and they were studying the menu with the intense focus of people calculating every dollar. The camera showed them finally ordering water for everyone and splitting 2 sandwiches and 1 bowl of soup among 5 people. Sofia had watched this, then gone to the kitchen and told Jimmy to make it look like the order was wrong. She'd brought out 3 full dinners, 2 kids' meals, and a basket of breadsticks, apologizing for the mix-up and insisting they couldn't take it back to the kitchen once it was made. The family had protested, but Sofia had been so convincing that they'd finally accepted it as a happy accident. The camera showed what happened after they left. The father had left a $10 tip on a meal he thought cost $20, not knowing the bill was actually $97. Sofia had covered the difference from 3 days of tips, and then the camera showed her sitting alone in the booth after they left, eating the family's leftover breadsticks for her own dinner because she hadn't eaten all day. Thomas paused the video and looked at Sofia. Her face was wet with tears she didn't remember starting to cry. He told her they had over 40 clips like this. 40 moments over 6 months where she'd chosen kindness over self-preservation, where she'd given away money she desperately needed, where she'd provided comfort to strangers while she was breaking inside, where she'd sacrificed her own meals, her own comfort, her own dignity to make someone else's day bearable. Thomas set the tablet down and pulled out his leather journal, the one Sofia would later learn he'd been carrying every time he came to observe her. He flipped through pages of handwritten notes, dates, times, observations. February 14th. Sofia gave her own dinner to homeless man who wandered in, 8 crackers from her purse instead. March 3rd. Stayed 2 hours past shift to help elderly customer call her son when she couldn't remember his number. March 22nd. Paid for family's meal. Total, $43. Has hole in shoe. Limping. He told Sofia that he'd been watching her transform his diner, that customer reviews had skyrocketed, not because of the food, which had always been good, but because of her. That people drove across town to eat at Rosie's specifically because they'd heard about the kind waitress who remembered their names and asked about their kids and made them feel seen. He said he'd watched her turn his last, struggling location into his most profitable one, not through business strategy, but through simple human kindness. Thomas explained that he'd gone back to his other 6 restaurants after that first night and started making changes. He trained his managers to look for employees like Sofia. He'd implemented policies about treating every customer with dignity, regardless of their appearance or ability to pay. He'd started a program where each location donated meals to local shelters. He'd done all of this because of what she'd shown him that November night. That the world wasn't as cold as his grief had convinced him it was. That goodness still existed. That his wife had been right when she'd always insisted that the restaurant business was about feeding souls, not just stomachs. But he'd kept coming back to Rosie's, he said, because he needed to know if that night had been a fluke. If Sofia had just been having a particularly generous moment, or if that kindness was who she actually was, day after day, even when it cost her everything. And the cameras had shown him the truth. They'd shown him 6 months of a young woman who gave away everything she had and never expected anything in return, who smiled through exhaustion and hunger and heartbreak because she believed that's what you're supposed to do, who kept choosing kindness even when life had given her every reason to become bitter. Thomas told Sofia that 3 months ago, he'd asked Ruth about her. Not in detail, just casual questions. How long had she worked here? Did she have family? Was she in school? Ruth had told him about Sofia's nursing dreams, about the tuition debt, about the canceled registration, about how Sofia still carried her old anatomy textbook in her car, even though she wasn't enrolled anymore, like she couldn't quite let go of the dream. About how she'd cried in Ruth's office and then dried her tears and gone right back to work because that's what she always did. That's when Thomas had made his decision. He'd spent the last 3 months working with his lawyers and accountants, setting everything up, making sure it was all done properly. He'd wanted to come forward sooner, he said, but he'd needed to be certain. Needed to have all the pieces in place. Because what he was about to offer Sofia wasn't charity. It was investment. It was recognition. It was payment for 6 months of transforming his business and his faith in humanity. Sofia asked him what he meant, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas smiled, and it was the same smile from that November night, grateful and knowing. He told her he had 3 things to discuss with her, 3 things that would change her life if she wanted them to. And he wanted her to understand that she'd earned every single one of them, that this wasn't mercy or pity. This was what happens when someone with power and resources witnesses genuine goodness and decides to honor it. The tablet screen had gone dark, but Sofia could still see the ghost of her own image reflected in it. 6 months of her life, compiled and documented. All the moments she'd thought were invisible. All the sacrifices she'd thought no one noticed. All the kindness she'd given without expecting return. It had all been seen. It had all mattered. And now, sitting in the empty diner at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in May, Sofia was about to learn that the smallest acts really do echo the loudest. Thomas opened his briefcase and pulled out 3 folders. He set them on the counter between them, his hand resting on top of the stack. He told Sofia that her entire life was about to change if she said yes to what was inside these folders. But before he opened them, he wanted her to understand something. He wanted her to know that she'd saved his life that November night, that watching her these past 6 months had given him a reason to keep going when grief had been drowning him, that she'd reminded him why he'd fallen in love with the restaurant business 40 years ago, that she'd shown him his wife's generosity, living on in a stranger, and that had been a gift beyond measure. Sofia was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe the tears away. She told Thomas she'd just been doing what felt right, that she didn't deserve all this attention, that anyone would have done the same thing. But Thomas shook his head firmly and told her she was wrong. He'd tested this at 6 other locations, hundreds of employees over 2 weeks, and only Sofia had passed. Only Sofia had seen a stranger in need and emptied her pockets without hesitation. Only Sofia had continued to choose kindness every single day for 6 months, never knowing anyone was watching. He picked up the first folder and slid it across the counter toward her. And what was inside that folder would be the first of 3 offers that would rewrite Sofia Martinez's entire future. Sofia's hands shook as she opened the first folder. Inside was a contract, official and printed on heavy paper with the Whitmore Restaurant Group letterhead embossed at the top. Her eyes scanned the words but couldn't quite make sense of them at first. General Manager, Rosie's Diner, salary, $75,000 annually. Benefits package including health insurance, dental, vision, and 4 weeks paid vacation. Start date, June 1st. She looked up at Thomas, her mouth open, unable to form words. He explained that Ruth was ready to retire. She'd been talking about it for 3 years but couldn't bring herself to leave because she didn't trust anyone to run the diner with the same heart she'd put into it for 30 years. But 2 weeks ago, Thomas had sat down with Ruth and asked her what she thought about Sofia taking over. Ruth had cried, he said. She'd told him it was the perfect solution, that Sofia already ran the place in all the ways that mattered, that customers loved her and the staff respected her. Ruth wanted to stay on as a consultant for 6 months to help with the transition, but after that, the diner would be Sofia's to manage. $75,000 a year. Sofia's current salary was $28,000. She'd been living below the poverty line for 4 years, rationing meals and wearing shoes with holes and choosing between electricity and groceries. $75,000 meant she could breathe. It meant she could eat 3 meals a day. It meant she could buy a winter coat that zipped. It meant she could send more money to Miguel, help him finish school, maybe even bring him to Chicago. But before Sofia could respond, before she could say yes or ask if this was real or collapse onto the floor from shock, Thomas picked up the second folder. He told her to wait, to see everything before she decided, because the general manager position was just the beginning. The second folder contained a letter from DePaul University's School of Nursing. Sofia's hands trembled so badly she almost couldn't hold the paper. The letter stated that an anonymous donor had established a scholarship in her name, the Sofia Martinez Scholarship for students of exceptional character. It would cover her remaining tuition in full, plus books, plus a living stipend of $1,500 a month. She could re-enroll immediately for the summer semester. She could finish her degree. She could become a nurse. Sofia made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She told Thomas this wasn't possible, that scholarships didn't work like this, that she'd been rejected from every financial aid program in the city. Thomas smiled and explained that this wasn't a traditional scholarship. He'd personally endowed it with $500,000, enough to cover Sofia's degree and then fund 9 other students after her. Students who demonstrated not just academic achievement, but genuine kindness. Students who gave even when they had nothing. Students like Sofia. He told her the scholarship had one condition. She had to accept the general manager position, because he believed she could do both. She could manage the diner during the day and take nursing classes in the evenings. It would be hard, he acknowledged. She'd be working and studying simultaneously, just like she had before. But this time, she'd have financial stability. This time, she wouldn't have to choose between rent and textbooks. This time, she'd have support. Sofia couldn't speak. She could only stare at the letter, reading it over and over, her tears making the ink blur. She thought about her mother, who'd wanted so badly for her to finish school. She thought about Miguel, who called her every week to check on her, even though he could barely afford the phone bill. She thought about all the nights she'd studied in this diner, cramming anatomy and pharmacology between refilling coffee cups and cleaning tables, believing that somehow, someday, she'd find a way to finish. Thomas let her cry for a minute, patient and quiet, before he picked up the third folder. This one was thinner than the others. Inside was a key and a single sheet of paper with an address written on it. An address just 4 blocks from the diner, in a building Sofia walked past every day on her way to work. Thomas explained that the building was one of his properties. Small apartments, mostly occupied by students and young professionals. A 1-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor had just become available. It had a real bedroom, a full kitchen, heating that worked, and windows that faced east so she'd get morning sunlight. The rent was normally $1,200 a month. For Sofia, it would be $500, utilities included. The difference would be considered part of her compensation package. He slid the key across the counter and told her she could move in this weekend if she wanted, that he'd had the place cleaned and painted, that there was a desk by the window where she could study, that it was quiet and safe, and she deserved a home that didn't make her choose between heat and food. Sofia picked up the key, and it felt impossibly heavy in her palm. $75,000, a full scholarship, an apartment with a bedroom. 6 months ago, she'd given away her last $20 to a stranger and thought that was the end of her luck. And now that stranger was handing her an entire future. She asked Thomas why. Why would he do all this for someone he barely knew? Why not just say thank you and move on? Why invest so much in one waitress from one diner? Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the empty street. The same street he'd walked down 6 months ago in a torn coat and muddy jeans. Then he told her a story. He said that when his wife Maria was dying, when the cancer had spread too far and the doctors had run out of options, she'd made him promise something. She'd told him that grief would try to make him bitter, would try to convince him that the world was cruel and cold. She'd asked him to fight that bitterness. She'd asked him to look for goodness, to find it and honor it and invest in it, because that's what she'd always done. That's what had made their 40 years together so full. Thomas said he'd failed that promise at first. He'd let the grief swallow him. He'd become cynical and hard. He'd decided to sell everything and walk away from the business they'd built together. But then Sofia had bought him dinner, and she'd shown him what Maria had always tried to tell him, that kindness compounds, that a $20 meal can save a soul, that investing in good people creates ripples that spread farther than money ever could. This wasn't charity, Thomas said. This was investment. He was investing in Sofia because he believed she would take these opportunities and turn them into something greater. She'd become a nurse who treated patients like the human beings they were. She'd managed the diner with the same heart she'd shown for 3 years. She'd probably give away half her salary to people who needed it more, just like she'd been doing all along. And all of that would create more goodness in the world, more ripples, more echoes. He told Sofia that she'd already paid for these opportunities 1,000 times over. Every meal she'd bought for strangers, every extra hour she'd worked without complaint, every kindness she'd shown when no one was watching. She'd been making deposits in an account she didn't know existed, and now he was simply balancing the books. Sofia looked at the 3 folders spread across the counter: a career, an education, a home. Everything she'd been fighting for, working for, praying for. All of it right here, offered by a man she'd fed soup 6 months ago. She thought about saying no, about insisting she didn't deserve this, about arguing that other people needed it more. But then she thought about her mother's voice in the hospital. Take care of your brother, no matter what. And she realized that accepting this gift wasn't selfish, it was survival. It was giving herself the tools to take care of Miguel, to help more people, to become the nurse her mother had dreamed she'd be. Sofia looked up at Thomas, her face wet with tears, and told him yes. Yes to all of it. Yes to the job and the scholarship and the apartment. Yes to this impossible second chance. Yes to believing that maybe, just maybe, the universe keeps score after all. Thomas smiled, and in that smile Sofia saw echoes of her mother, of Ruth, of every person who'd ever chosen to believe in goodness despite evidence to the contrary. He shook her hand formally, like they were sealing a business deal, because that's exactly what they were doing. Then he pulled her into a hug, the kind of hug that feels like forgiveness and hope, and the end of a very long winter. He told her to take tomorrow off to move into the apartment, that Ruth would cover her shift, that on Thursday they'd sit down with Ruth and start the transition plan, that in 2 weeks she'd start her first semester back at DePaul, that her life was about to get very busy, but that he'd be checking in regularly to make sure she had everything she needed, not as a boss, he said, but as someone who owed her more than he could ever repay. Sofia walked out of the diner that night at midnight with 3 folders under her arm and a key in her pocket. The rain had stopped and the air smelled clean, like the city was holding its breath. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the neon sign flickering pink and blue above Rosie's diner, and she thought about that November night 6 months ago, how she'd locked up and walked home in the rain with $3 and no idea how she'd survive the week. How she'd thought giving away her last $20 might have been the stupidest decision of her life. She'd been so wrong. So here's what I want you to understand. Sofia's story is real in the ways that matter most. It's real because somewhere, right now, someone is choosing kindness, even though it costs them everything. Somewhere, right now, someone is being watched by security cameras and angels, and a universe that keeps better records than we think. Somewhere, right now, someone is one small act of generosity away from changing 2 lives forever. The lesson isn't that kindness always gets rewarded. The lesson is that kindness is the reward. That Sofia slept better on those nights when she'd given away her dinner than on the nights she'd kept it. That the $20 she spent on a stranger's meal bought her something no amount of money could. The knowledge that she'd chosen right over easy. That she'd seen someone suffering and refused to look away. But here's the secret. Thomas understood and Maria had tried to teach him. When you honor kindness, when you invest in good people, you create a world where more kindness is possible. Sofia will go on to become a nurse. She'll treat thousands of patients over her career with the same dignity she showed to strangers in a diner. She'll manage Rosies and train a generation of waitresses to see customers as human beings, not transactions. She'll send money to Miguel and her aunt and probably a dozen other people who need it. And somewhere down the line, one of those people will pay it forward to someone else. That's the echo. That's the ripple. That's what happens when a 22-year-old girl with $3 and a broken shoe decides that a stranger's hunger matters more than her own safety. The kindness compounds. It grows. It transforms not just individual lives, but the character of communities, the culture of businesses, the fabric of the world itself. Thomas learned something that night too. He learned that his wife's voice still spoke through strangers, That grief doesn't have to make you bitter if you keep your eyes open for goodness. That the business he'd built with Maria could become a living memorial to her values if he chose to honor them. That 40 years of partnership doesn't end with death. It transforms into legacy. So here's my challenge to you, watching this right now. Look for the Sofia in your life. Look for the person who's choosing kindness when they can't afford it. The single mother splitting one sandwich between 3 kids. The elderly person counting pennies for coffee. The employee who stays late without being asked. The neighbor who shovels your driveway without expecting thanks. Look for them and honor them. Invest in them. Tell them you see what they're doing. And if you're Sofia, if you're the one giving away your last $20 right now, hear me when I say this. It's not invisible. The cameras are watching. The universe is keeping score. And somewhere, someone like Thomas is about to walk into your life and change everything. Keep choosing kindness. Keep believing it matters. Keep feeding strangers even when you're hungry. Because the echo is coming. The ripple is spreading. The redemption is closer than you think. If this story changed something in you, if you're sitting there with tears in your eyes, thinking about the Sofia in your own life, or recognizing yourself in her struggle, then do something about it. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let's create a community of people who believe that kindness compounds, that goodness grows, that the smallest acts echo the loudest. We're building toward 1 million subscribers, and every single one of you is part of a movement that says the world doesn't have to be cold and cynical, that there are still Sofia Martinezes out there, choosing right over easy, that there are still Thomas Whitmores willing to honor that choice, that there are still stories worth telling about the better angels of our nature. Subscribe now. Turn on that bell. Drop a comment telling me about a time someone showed you unexpected kindness, or a time you chose to be kind when it cost you everything. Let's fill this comment section with evidence that Sofia's story isn't rare. It's happening all around us, all the time, in 1,000 small ways we're not paying attention to. Because here's the truth Thomas discovered and Sofia lived. We're all being watched. Not by cameras or surveillance systems, but by people who notice, by children who learn, by strangers who remember, by a universe that measures us, not by what we have, but by what we give when we have nothing. So give anyway, love anyway, choose kindness anyway, feed the stranger, share your last dollar, stay late to help, smile at the rude customer. See people, really see them, and trust that somewhere, somehow, the echo is building, the ripple is spreading, and the redemption is already on its way. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing. Thank you for being the kind of person who made it all the way to the end of this story. Now go out there and be somebody's Thomas, or be somebody's Sofia. Either way, be the reason someone still believes in goodness. Subscribe, share, comment, and let's change the world, one $20 meal at a time.